Welcome guys, gals and non-binary pals to this week's episode of Buffy Boys, your weekly review of Buffy the Vampire Slayer from a queer, feminist and literary perspective. I'm your host Joel, and joining me as always is my polymath co-host.
Polymath?
You have to say your name there.
No, that can't be me then.
It is you.
But I only know one math.
Who are you?
Brian, hi.
Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thanks. Polymath is a bit much now.
No, you're very skilled.
Very skilled at being stupid.
Yes, that's definitely in there. You can play any instruments. That's how I found it very impressive.
I would have disagreed with you for a long time, but I did pick up the trombone about 5 or 6 years ago.
Did you put it down again?
Yeah, I haven't played it in a while, but I picked up a trombone and I learned how to play like a brass instrument, and just the embouchure was needed, and you know the idea of what is playing a brass instrument. And you know what playing a brass instrument is? Mm-hmm. It's doing this a bunch.
Wow, that looks great on the audio feed.
So you do that into a thing, and it just like amplifies that noise essentially, and that's the whole thing. Anyway, so yeah, I can actually pick up most instruments and play them, I'd say, as well as you could if you were really bad and had lessons for a year. Yeah,
I can't play any instruments, but I am really good at cubing a pineapple.
You are really good at cubing.
So we all have our strengths. So welcome to Buffy Boys. This week we are talking about season 3, episode 11, Gingerbread.
More like Ginger Dead.
Oh, here we go. Bring that energy to the Buffy Ann summary you're about to give me, which you have open and ready to go.
Yeah. Okay, so this is season 3, episode 11. It was first aired on January the 12th, 1999. It was written by Jane Espenson and Thania St. John. It might be St. John. You never know these people. You know, some people say St. John.
Some people pronounce St. John as St. John.
Yeah.
I've never heard that before. That's interesting.
I might be going crazy there, but I do believe so. Thania St. John, this is the only episode she wrote for Buffy Boys. But for Buffy the Vampire Slayer, not Buffy Boys. That is our podcast.
The walls are collapsing.
Yeah. She was actually one of the founding members of the League of Hollywood Women Writers, which is cool.
That sounds incredibly epic.
Yeah, but I can't see very much otherwise about her. She wrote a couple of episodes for different things, but nothing that we would specifically note. Anyway.
Nothing good then.
And it was directed by James Whitmore Jr., who we last had in Beauty and the Beasts. Buffy Ann summary. Haunting. Okay, so this is difficult to read because it grammatically makes no sense, but here we go. Haunting by apparently sacrificed children sends Joyce and Willow's mothers on a rampage against occultism.
That is difficult to parse.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Snyder seizes Giles's books for burning, and Buffy, Willow, and Amy are condemned for witchcraft. Amy escapes by changing into a rat. Cordelia intervenes with a fire hose, and Buffy breaks the spell which enabled the demon to pose as the dead children and kills it. Like, why not include, that? Oh, there are pages falling into my book. 1 second.
Cordelia intervenes with a fire hose is one of my favourite Shakespearean stage directions.
Yeah, it's of course.
That's wild. So this is very much the episode where the only episode where Willow's mother appears and where 2 dead children convince everyone to burn the Scoobies at the stake. So yeah, that's all.
That's it. Yeah. What did you think about the episode?
I thought it was a lot of fun. I thought tonally, plot wise, everything was wildly all over the place.
Yes.
And like an episode of a different TV show in some ways, but I had a lot of fun watching it.
Yeah, it's like, for my money's worth, there are 2 great versions of Buffy. It's the stupid as fuck Buffy, which this was one of them. And also trying to deal with heady themes and like fucking it up kind of badly.
Heady themes or heady teens.
Yeah, exactly. Or the exemplary episodes of Buffy. And the things that fall in between are the things I tend to not like that much.
Sure, yeah.
Which I think a lot of season 4 is in between.
You have to commit to things. But speaking of things which seem narratively and tonally just completely off point, we watched X-Men 12 Dark Phoenix this week.
No, we didn't.
No?
No, I don't remember that.
Ah, very good.
There's nothing about that movie. I kind of watched it because I don't remember any plot from it, any of the shots from it, any of the lines from it.
This is a hot take about a film that came out like a year ago. Is it a year ago now?
No, it's not quite a year ago. It's about 6 months.
Okay. But yeah, the last gasp of the X-Men films from the Fox licensing, the classic kind of X-Men series, before it reverts to, before it was acquired by the Marvel conglomerate, Guess Off Mind.
Interesting.
Yeah, so this is the last X-Men. This is what I was saying to when we watched it. It's the last X-Men film. But it was not good.
Oh, so bad.
And we've watched the occasional bad film. But dear listener, this film is utterly unrememberable. I say 6 or 7 times since we watched it, which was only a couple of days ago, I've actually forgotten that I've seen it, and I was convinced that it was a film. Like, you know, when you see a film in a dream, it's like I'm watching scenes, and my dream self is saying that they're connected, but they're obviously not. But this was completely incomprehensible. That's essentially the experience I had watching this film. Brian, you're a casual X-Men fan. What did you think of this film's portrayal of the iconic Dark Phoenix storyline?
Just like, oh my god. I mean...
So what is the Dark Phoenix thing? What should it be?
Yeah, sure. So the Dark Phoenix is the culmination of just like the early era of X-Men in some ways. It is the original X-Men going to space because Jean Grey has come back from the dead with these new powers where she's super powerful and she's essentially like a world destroyer. So Jean Grey, this very mild-mannered, very caring woman, turns into this very, very aggressive, very, very uncaring god, essentially. And the whole thing is about like having to stop her. She gets tried by a bunch of different a bunch of different alien species.
Technically species, but science fiction tends to call them races.
Yeah, you're right. Species in space court, and she eventually sacrifices herself to make sure that like this doesn't happen.
Yeah. And the Phoenix Force that she kind of embodies is meant to be this like universe creating, ending, core primal power, essentially.
Exactly. She does exemplify the Phoenix Force for years after that in bits and pieces and different ways, but it's one of the great comic book moments, you know? I think X-Men will be the comic book that's remembered over time, if you get me. So I think that there are instances of Batman that are incredible, usually the standalone Batman stories. Yeah. So the Long Halloween, I think, is that the Dark Knight Rises, the Year One. Those ones are all incredible. Avengers. The Killing Joke, absolutely. The Avengers doesn't really have any standout, storylines.
As a comic, yeah.
I mean, some of the more recent ones are pretty standout. Civil War was pretty cool. Or say Fantastic Four, who gives a shit.
But X-Men is just replete with these storylines that you remember. The Age of Apocalypse.
Age of Apocalypse is a masterpiece. The Dark Phoenix saga is incredible. Days of Future Past, absolutely. God Loves Man Kills, I think, is one of the best written texts I've ever read. But yeah, they somehow continuously managed to fuck up X-Men stories, specifically Dark Phoenix. So Dark Phoenix was also a major storyline in the original X-Men movies, i.e. the Bryan Singer. Well, Bryan Singer directed some of the more recent ones as well.
Famke Janssen as Jean Grey,
exactly.
And probably most memorably Hugh Jackman as Wolverine.
Yes. So the third X-Men movie, X-Men The Last Stand, was a total shit show. They managed to spell like 3 people's names wrong in the opening credits of that movie. Yeah. And the opening of that movie had the subtitle "In the Not Too Distant Future." T.O.
Yeah.
So
setting a bad
it's setting a bad precedent right there.
Yeah.
So just as a starting place, just like that, like it was a fucked up story to begin with, and then they revisited here by someone who had never written a script for a movie before, and it was had never directed before, and it was total trash.
But am I correct in saying that the writer for this film
also wrote Apocalypse? Also
wrote Last Stand.
Oh, I think I'm not 100% certain.
I feel like I've heard that, or at the very least, some of the people involved, this is their second crack at doing the Phoenix story. Amongst the many issues with that are the more recent X-Men films, the prequels have had a great sense of temporality. They were set in the 70s or the 80s, and that was very much part of it, and that was intriguing. This, in theory, is set in the 90s, and there's no element of... It's so generic. It's released, obviously, around the time of Endgame, and in comparison to the Marvel films, it's just so... Like at one point, what's her name? Jennifer Lawrence's character has a line where she says, "The women are always saving the men around here. Maybe we should change the name of the team to the X-Women." What does that even mean? Yeah. And just like random people dying.
Jennifer Lawrence, like such a talent, so fucking wasted. And so I mean, here's a spoiler, so click off for like 10 seconds. But Jennifer Lawrence's Mystique gets killed in this movie very like aggressively, unnecessarily, and so weirdly. And it's 100% because Jennifer Lawrence wanted out of that fucking contract.
Yeah, it's really it's not abrupt, but just meaningless.
Yep, the whole thing is meaningless. Yeah. Just every scene just like feels like so loosely connected. Like it's impossible to understand how one leads onto another, what the storyline is, what any of the characters' motivations are.
And like Jessica Chastain, who's English, who's ostensibly the villain to some degree, is playing like a really generic, like faceless alien that has no motivation, no name, and specifically textually no emotions.
Yeah, Jessica Chastain's incredible. So.
Yeah, absolutely. But specifically, like the previous films have built up these relationships between the X-Men, established them, and there was no sense of anyone knowing who they were or what they wanted to do. Mm-hmm. But maybe for me, one of the biggest missing things is, and the reason why we love X-Men is a really strong sense of theme to X-Men. And we've talked about before how they represent, they can be used as ciphers for a number of oppressed minority groups or ostracized groups, but probably quite strongly identify with queerness and with the gay rights movement.
Yeah.
Just in terms of it's 1985, do you know what your children are, and have you tried not being a mutant and all this kind of stuff, and that. Like Dark Phoenix was an intensely heterosexual film.
It really was.
There was just no.
There was no gay boy behind that imagining being the Phoenix as a 12-year-old. Yeah, and that's what you need for the Dark Phoenix saga.
Yeah. So speaking of metaphors for queerness and secret powers, so we have in this episode of Buffy in Gingerbread a real focus on witches, which I actually think is interesting. That it's do you say directed by the same person who did Beauty and the Beasts?
It's directed by the same person who did Beauty and the Beasts.
Yeah, because this is like a very vampire adjacent episode of Buffy, as in, so even some of the demon episodes and all that, you feel it's very much in that kind of central vampire through line, but this is an also story. Actually, funnily, what I was thinking about, it reminds me of while I was watching it, is the Halloween films, all 27 of them, have this through line of Michael Myers in them, and the curse of Michael Myers, etc. Except for number 3, which is called Season of the Witch, which is just an anthology Halloween, like about scary things that happen on Halloween and witches and stuff. And I felt that this don't remind me of that, in the sense that this it wasn't necessarily a bad episode, it wasn't a good episode, but it could be lifted into a number of different supernatural type shows where the premise is, even the fact that in this episode Xander is surprised to hear that some fairy tales have basis in truth, it's like that's your entire world. Yeah, vampires are real.
It's like probably 14 episodes ago that you had the exact same fucking situation with the
Der Kinderstod.
Thank you. So he experienced that like so recently.
Yeah,
didn't he kill it?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, actually.
And he's just like, oh, fuck, forgot about that.
Yeah. So, but yeah, this idea that Hansel and Gretel are actually based on
young kids who come along and every 50 years convince a whole town to sacrifice some women, and in this kind of mob mentality, go back to the Salem witch trials. Yeah. Which was, Salem witch trials always fascinating because it's like, thousands and thousands of women were killed during witch trials across Europe and America, and basically it's so much of it is about just showing women their place, and this kind of hysteria of like showing women that they need to be controlled and they can't be trusted.
Hysteria being a very, very interesting word choice to use there.
Good point.
But yeah, no, I really do appreciate the way that Buffy integrates quite strongly witchcraft. It is probably the strongest other mythological theme in Buffy other than vampires.
Sure.
And it's great because witchcraft has at its core both textually and subtextually. And you'll hear outside, dear listener, we're in the middle of a thunderstorm right now, so that's the atmospheric background there.
It's pathetic fallacy.
Pathetic fallacy, indeed. There's a textual and subtextual link with witchcraft, with feminism, and with women, and with female power, and female empowerment specifically.
And lesbianism.
And lesbianism, absolutely. Or if nothing else, sexual liberation for women and sexual comforting in your sexual emotional self, as opposed to intense repression, which is what they were reacting against. And yeah, so having that as like the other string to Buffy's bow, I really just gives it that additional layer of women's experience, which Willow can bring to it with a different kind of strength to what Buffy has.
Yes,
which I think is very essential. Cause not everyone's a Slayer.
I think so too. I think it's definitely the other thing that this show needed when this show came onto the scene in 1996, and they were like, "Oh, we're doing vampires." it needed to like, you know, progress to we do witches too. You know, I think that's definitely the other thing. It's so funny because like, it's so interesting because Angel specifically as a TV show doesn't do witches. You know, it very much veers towards like the kind of the underworldly horror and the kind of the brute force response.
Mob, corporations, serial killers, that
exactly.
kind of vibe.
It's intensely masculine, and it's an interesting exploration of masculinity and of men's approaches to like traditional approaches to these kind of situations. But it like this show has that like femininity going for it that is just so why it clicked so much more than Angel did, I think. Important to note as well, I think this episode is very heavily influenced by The Crucible, Arthur Miller, the worst Nobel Prize winner for literature of all time, probably, even though I quite like him. The Crucible obviously being set in the Salem witch trials. But
do you remember I was in a very short performance of The Crucible at one point?
I do remember that. It was in a shed.
It was like someone's like
it was in a shed in the drama department in Trinity.
Yeah, it was like someone's drama like project. They were being assessed on it. So,
yeah. You were good at it.
Thank you. No, it's interesting that you make the comparison to Angel there, because what Angel does is very much the American myth and the American mythological, the capitalism, corporation, the Great Expanse, etc. And this episode really hammers home that Buffy's actually quite different about that. Buffy really leans into the European roots of mythology.
It's a very good note.
Yeah, the like werewolves.
Well done, Joel.
Thank you.
Do you want a handshake?
Ding ding ding. The Paul Hollywood handshake.
Ugh, disgusting.
But it's so like there's a certain oral history to this kind of stuff where I think the Angel and the Watchers and all that kind of stuff are very written as very literary. This sense of methodologies that are passed down between slayers, between witches, and all that kind of stuff. It's very European in its roots, and obviously the thing that people love to dive into is that the Grimm's brothers' tales, the original ones, were much darker than the sanitized Disney versions, and we've talked about this before in terms of fairy tales, but it really roots here that, you know, that the witchcraft stuff is rooted in kind of the early puritanical part of a
so much pain, I'm sorry.
Pins and needles.
Yeah, why do I do this like this? Oh my god.
Sorry. So sorry, listener, we could take a substantial recording break there because Brian sat on his leg and gave himself such significant pins and needles that he was actually in tangible pain from it.
This is my life.
Yeah, this is what I live with. So it really roots it in this kind of European folklore and this sense of the fear of the quote-unquote old world and the old country. Like what country that was, who knows? But I quite enjoy it.
Denmark, probably.
Denmark, maybe, yeah, that kind of area. It's definitely some are very forested or very obviously Germany. But yeah, I quite like that element of this episode, I have to say.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was reading it. So we talked about the Kinderstood, which episode was something by death, killed by death.
Killed by death.
I mentioned an essay in that episode, which was by Sarah E. Squire, which is Whose Side Are You On Anyway? Children, Adults, and the Use of Fairy Tales in Buffy. So we talked about Killed by Death and how in that episode the monster, like, you know, you can only see it if you're in a childlike state, and it very much highlights the separation between children and adults, children being the truth seers, adults being the blind, essentially, and Buffy's ability to transition between the two states, you know, and willingness to believe the children, etc. But she also, of course, highlights this episode, and the third episode she writes about in this specific essay is Hush, obviously, because Hush is so fairy tale-y, obviously. But yeah, so there are a couple of things here that she talks about that I love that we'll weave in through what we're talking about in this episode. I mean, she says, the inversion of traditional parent-child roles is clear and sets the tone for the remainder of the episode. All of Joyce's actions and choices will be governed by her desire to respond to these murders in a responsible and adult way. All of her choices will be wrong. Or that Joyce, subconsciously or not, places teenagers into the category of unnatural evils is clear to the audience from the moment that she equates slayers and witches, her daughter and her daughter's best friend, with monsters. So, like, I mean, it's all very interesting stuff. So, and she kind of concludes about this specific episode. Once again, it is a proper understanding of how to read a fairy tale that has delineated the difference between adults and children. Once again, it is the ability to read a fairy tale as truth, to see the very real demons that hide behind the guise of the figurative, psychologizing reading of the tale, that has distinguished the wise from the foolish. So in this episode, it very much delineates between children and adults. We were talking about this during the recording of the episode, but it was very unclear as to what the lines were in terms of who was influenced by the demons. So we saw some of the children, some of the teenagers seem to be influenced by it. They were bullying Michael, who
was the warlock, the boy witch that was,
or Wiccan maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I think this show tends to lean on warlock, but I wouldn't like tie someone to a terminology. But it is one of the few examples we see of someone practicing this kind of Willow and Amy style witchcraft.
Mm-hmm. And let's acknowledge he's a gothy boy, but he's also quite effete. So I mean, there's a suggestion there of queerness.
Yeah, there's definitely like a table of people you see sitting together, and it might be because they're all some level of queer and some level of coming out to themselves and others, or because they might be witches, or both. That's kind of the vibe. It's just like outsiderish, but like not in a Breakfast Club kind of way, kind of actual. I think that actually gave like a level of verisimilitude to me, a certain level of believability, because they actually seem like high schoolers, as opposed to like witches. I
agree. So some of the teenagers bully him. It might just be that they have a good excuse now, but we were talking about how it's interesting that Giles isn't affected by these demons, and how it feels like it's not as simple as adults versus children. It's more like those who are willing to see things for the truth that is in it versus the people who have shut off their kind of perception to that kind of thing and are willing to be manipulated.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think Buffy is probably one of the earlier shows to really imply this trope, but they very rarely suggest that the general populace of Sunnydale has had their memory altered in any kind of way. Yes. And this is another episode that ends with a collective agreeing to, initially Joyce, while under the influence, challenges the fact that they always ignore the statistically high amount of neck ruptures that happen in Sunnydale and things like that.
In a slightly it was shot slightly fascistly. I thought there was a little bit of the triumph of the will to it.
Oh, there's a lot of fascist imagery through this, and because that's like the core, the sense of censorship uniting people against subversive elements in the society. It's not necessarily subtle, but it's not necessarily poorly used either. Yep. And ultimately, like they are burnt on a pile of books. So
very Ray Bradbury.
Yeah, very much so, Brian. But it's never really strongly suggested that anyone in Sunnydale is doing anything other than willfully forgetting and willfully, as Willow herself highlights at the end of the episode, selective memory. Yeah. And the difference between Giles and some of the people who aren't affected, as you say, it's not an age thing, it's not a kind of a clearly marked mystical effect. It's just Giles chooses to see things as they actually are, which I think makes him much less susceptible to any of these kind of suggestive spells.
Gotcha. The other very notable example of people like taking a step back and being like, we all know what's going on here, of course, also occurs in this season.
Incredible.
In the prom, when Buffy is spoken to by Jonathan, and they say, we all know this is happening, and Buffy takes care of us, essentially. So, I mean, obviously a theme for the season, very much ties in with, there are a couple of tying ins here with The Wish. So in The Wish, we talked about, what if Buffy wasn't here? In this episode, Buffy specifically voices that worry herself. Have I made a difference? Because Joyce says to her, you haven't made a difference. You
can't make it right.
You can't make it right. Which, I mean, let's not be. I don't mean to be this person every time, but also a very existential theme. What difference do I make here? If nothing matters, I mean, if nothing we do matters, then all we matters is what we do. Yeah, that's the angel quote, isn't it?
That's the angel quote, but it's also but Buffy said that in the last episode. You know that living is painful and it's fighting every day. That's the core thesis of the show. I've always maintained. Yeah.
But it connects as well to The Witch is explored. What if I wasn't here? This episode asks, do I make a difference? And then the prom being the ultimate answer of yes, it does matter. You are making this difference to us. We acknowledge that. and that being like actually a very lovely kind of note at the end of the season, essentially saying thank you, Buffy.
Oh, yeah, it's beautiful.
I mean, like I'm getting a little teary thinking about the prom.
Yeah, you're going to weep.
Oh god.
But there's a touch of it here as well, because I find it interesting that when the bullies are beating up Michael, the boy witch, that when Buffy arrives specifically, that they back off and be like, oh, we're going to get our asses kicked. So there is an understanding that Buffy is not ostracized as such, but like she can't kick your ass and is generally there when these things happen. So I think that is starting to be threaded through. But like the opening scene of this episode that sets it all off is Joyce arriving while Buffy is patrolling, bringing her snacks.
It's so wonderful.
And saying, this is such a big part of your life. I want to see you sharing your slaying and understand this part, what you do. And while she's beating up the vampire, being like, go on, honey, kill him. Like it's a very
Mr. Sanderson from the bank.
yeah, it's a very clear portrayal of a parent trying to understand and be part of a teenager's life that is very different from theirs, and that can be applied to a number of different circumstances. But it definitely is like there definitely is this metaphor of Joyce of someone who has struggled with handling it coming out badly initially, and now trying to be like, I want to understand, bring me to the George,
I literally have one of my notes here is Joyce going slaying is like me bringing my parents to Panty Bar.
But the George and Panty Bar, let's just remind for our non-Irish listeners, being the premier / only gay venues in Dublin.
I think they might be the only official ones. Actually no, Penny Lane is probably official as well, because the front lounge, which hasn't been called the front lounge for about 6 years now, but no one calls it by its actual...
Street 66.
Street 66 is the gay bar, the other gay bar in Dublin that didn't shut down, and when they got bought over by this new these new people, they turned it into like a reggae bar with
Bob Marley, like literally on all the TV screens.
And everyone's like, okay, it's nice that you're trying to make it a reggae bar, but like, good luck getting any straight people in here.
Yeah. But so I think that's a nice setup for it. And then she finds the boggies and is very horrified by it. But a very interesting note that Buffy highlights in universe is that people die in Sunnydale all the time. Why are people caring about this? And there's a touch of because it's Kigs and all that. People have died before. Kigs died in the hospital.
Yep.
So there's obviously while at the same time that the demon is influencing people to ignore certain things, it's also influencing them to observe certain things that they wouldn't usually.
I mean, like I think there's a real case we made for the suggestion that the Hellmouth is actually influencing the residents of Sunnydale to ignore what they see. That there is some like mystical influence there, that they will just forget, they will experience this collective amnesia, just because it's the only way they can continue to live in this area,
Yeah, well, I always think in terms of the mystical elements of the show, it's like what Spike said about how a lot of people talk about anything in the world, but few people actually want to do it, is that there has to be a balance, in the sense that if you want this to be a continuous feeding ground, if you want, you have to graze on humans and torture them, but allow them to have some modicum of replenishing. So I do think the Hellmouth does influence that. It wants to perpetuate itself, and a Hellmouth, there's nothing to torment if no one lives there. Yeah,
you're right. One of the things that Mark Field writes about this episode is that it's a conclusion to Angel's personal struggle, which is very interesting. So we saw him a couple episodes ago reading La Nausée by Sartre, which caused him his existential crisis, essentially. He read it and he thought, why am I here? What is my meaning? We saw a absurd, meaningless world in the Wish, an uncaring, unfeeling meaninglessness. And then in the last episode of Men's, we saw him struggling with this tension of, should I kill myself? Do I end it when there is no meaning? In this episode, he basically says, Buffy, you've taught me that the meaning is in the doing, making a choice to continue and to find something past that absurdity and past, if nothing matters and all that matters is what we do. And that's the conclusion of his journey, and it's really, I think that is the end of his personal progress for this season. I think we have now set him up for moving forward to Angel, to making actual amends and to finding his self after this kind of existential crisis, which is actually, it's such an overused phrase, an existential crisis, but people kind of use it to mean, oh, I don't care, essentially, whereas this is like a genuine, explored existential structural crisis, which is really fascinating. And Yeah, so I just think this is a nice conclusion to it.
No, absolutely. And I think Angel has a very interesting relationship with the hero's journey because Buffy's born into it. She'll never not be the Slayer. She occasionally flirts with that, with the fact of Faith taking over the main Slayer line, but being a Slayer is what Buffy is. Angel's not born to destiny. And as it goes on through Angel, he at times finds comfort and also constriction in the fact that he is actually part of a specific prophecy. And occasionally when it seems that prophecy applies to other people, he feels like he's actually free to do what he wants to do, which is help people outside the confines of this structure, you know. Mm-hmm. So you rarely see men who are not destined to be heroes or are not natural born heroes. It's very much a choosing, which I think is very interesting.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
And it also ties back to Buffy. At the start of this episode, she talks about the assumption, a slightly unfounded assumption, I think, but the assumption that the Kigs must have been killed by a monster rather than people, and that the symbol that is painting on their hands, which erroneously leads them to the witches, is an indication that could be a human occult and kind of a serial killer, not a serial killer, but a mystic killer kind of thing. And Buffy says, with disgust, someone with a soul did this.
Yeah.
And says, find a loophole in that whole Slayer can't kill humans thing. So as we've established, this is a fiction. She tells herself she has killed many people, indirectly or indirectly, or allowed people to come to harm. But also, this shows relationship with the concept that a soul is what determines your morality. And the morality of what you do and what separates animals, which your animalistic creatures, which can't be held accountable to some degree in a moral sense, from people who have a responsibility. It's at times inconsistent. I think because it's an uncertain, inconsistent conversation to have in reality.
Most importantly, in Spike's development through season 6.
Yeah, but Buffy, I think, develops a really black and white relationship with this, which is solidified by her experiences with Angelus. Angelus, I can't believe I did it. I cannot believe you've infected me. But I think that she, of all people, needs to believe that a soul differentiates you in an essential way from your soulless self. Mm-hmm. And the soul is where the responsibility is, because that's how she justifies her continued relationship with Angel. And the other characters don't necessarily have that distinction, but she would. Most
importantly, Giles doesn't when he strangles Ben.
Yeah, Giles absolutely doesn't. And there are a couple of human characters in the Buffy universe who are soulless, and I think Buffy would have no problem killing them.
Yeah. So maternity is obviously quite interesting in this episode. I mean, you know, Joyce does represent a failure to parent, and so does Sheila. Sheila is a very fascinating character in this episode. It's the only time she appears. It's the only time Willow's mother. She's such a failure in the sense that she's a purely theoretical parent. She had a conversation with Willow 6 months ago about Mr. Rogers and patriarchy, but doesn't notice that Willow cut her hair a year ago.
Yeah,
which you mentioned earlier. Actually, sorry, I forgot about that. I think this is probably the last time we're going to have to touch on this essay that I read that we keep coming back to. But it's Choosing Your Own Mother, Mother-Daughter Conflicts in Buffy by J.P. Williams. And in this essay, this episode is obviously highlighted, and there's a couple of things mentioned here. What I found most interesting here was this kind of suggestion. Gingerbread depicts the fear of losing the mother's love that threatens during adolescence. The horror in the episode, therefore, is not the demon disguising itself as two angelic children. It is the moment Sheila turns a Willow. Raising her voice, calling Willow witch, and then reminding her to take her coat because it's cold out, Sheila personifies the disaster that women fear will result from mother and daughter's psychological separation. Absolutely. You know, it's this kind of alienation between mother and daughter. That's the core tension here. And while none of these essays are read in, highlighted as a specific queer narrative, I personally would. Obviously, I don't mean to tread on the toes of feminist readings of these things, or suggest that women's actual experiences should be read through a queer lens. But just this would be my personal reading of it. It's just that fear of parental alienation, in a post coming out kind of thing. Michael at one point comes to the library in this episode and says, I've been kicked out of my home. My father beat me up.
My dad and his friends beat me up.
My dad and his friends beat me up, and Giles like, it's okay, you stay in my office kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very hard not to. And when Willow's talking to to her mother, and her mother's like, oh, it's just a phase. I mean, it's very hard not to read that as a
Yeah.
specific queer moment.
I think it's because, like, essentially, like, a lot of the, as we discussed before, a lot of the tensions and a lot of the identity politics that come around resisting or interacting with the kind of more patriarchal, the more heteronormative mainstream, are shared by women, by queer people, and by other minority groups. Now, there's a lot of distinctions between those, but the core thing of the other versus the mass manifests in very similar ways. But I do think that conversation that Sheila, Willow's mother, has with her can only really be read in a queer context, because it's very much her saying, her mother is bizarrely, for a character who is never really discussed before in any great detail and never appears again.
She's really well established.
She's really fully formed.
Yeah.
And she's very much a academic. She talks about, I've read theories about teenage development. I've talked to my colleagues and they've said this is a classic case of etc. etc. And she's trying to convince her mother that she is a witch, she can do spells, she has these powers and all this, and says, oh no, these delusions you think you do, and that's what worries me, and this is acting out. And Willow says, I'm not a demographic, I'm not I'm not an age group, I'm a Willow group, I'm me, this is me, and I can do it, and I'm essentially proud of it. And then when she doesn't believe her, actually gets hyperbolic and starts saying, like, dear Dark Lord, nasty devil, please come inside me with all your magic powers, etc. I'm calling down Beelzebub on you. Please enter me with all your magic powers.
Both are not good, Joel.
You know what I'm trying to say here. But that is the coming out conversation, do you know what I mean? And sitting across each other in the sitting room, and how Willow is almost excited to be able to tell her this, and is then like disappointed with how badly it goes. And her mother saying, all that's left now is like to let you go with love. That was Sheila, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Wasn't
it
Joyce.
was. It was so disturbing.
And there's just elements of kind of conversion therapy in there, and religious kind of exorcism, anti-gay camps. All of this is very in that language. I also did note, this episode was rife with things that quotes I want to remember to say to my friends in future, such as, I said, get your coat, witch. I can see myself using that in a lot of contexts.
Lots of satanic panic, of course, in this episode.
Yes.
Did you read this? Apparently the California town of Torrance, which Buffy was shot in, was the home of quite a lot of the satanic panic source. As in, a lot of satanic panic conversations happened in that kind of area, which is really fascinating. So if you're not aware, satanic panic was a thing that happened in the 80s, whereby a lot of, moms, traditionally, got very worried about these Dungeons and Dragons games that the kids were playing these days, and they probably were sacrificing children, culminating in the West Memphis 3, whereby 3 young men in the early 90s were convicted of ritually slaughtering a bunch of children because they liked death metal and stuff like that, with absolutely no information. There are no corroborating evidence. There's nothing to suggest that they were anywhere near the scene, etc. Some really, really fascinating documentaries made about it, specifically HBO's Paradise Lost. Go out, check it out. Satanic panic, so specifically influenced by Dungeons and Dragons for some reason.
Yeah, well, I suppose like the earliest editions of Dungeons and Dragons were very much just drew on really fundamental folklore. It was vampires, it was werewolves, it was devils, angels, demons, and it was much less imaginative to a certain degree, but not in a bad way. It was just drawing on these really classic, similar Grimm's Brothers kind of things. And because of this reaction to satanic panic, a lot of the later editions, you still have demons and devils, but they're called Tanari and Beta Zoo, and
so it just gets racist instead of satanic.
Why?
Oh, just that kind of language is like that exotic named thing. It's like it has such a racist element to it.
It can do. I think it's more reframing it. Well, now I'm questioning my entire worldview, but I think it's like an alien kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay.
But I suppose there's always that element of Planet of Hacks where if you make your alien race be kind of like something from China and one element of it, it's like, yes, it's of course racist.
Of course, more importantly, the planet of shrimp.
Yes, and of course a planet without any shrimp. But yeah, so this is very rooted in this sense that I don't know why bigoted people have no concept of imagination, where they're like, you can read about doing something and it's like a story, but you don't necessarily want to be that person. They can't have this separation where it's like you can play Dungeons and Dragons and not necessarily want to actually sacrifice people.
Yeah.
You know, like I read a lot of Harry Potter and that kid's an absolute wonk and I have no interest in being him or anywhere near that kind of world. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think that that's definitely an interesting note, and it's very rooted in this small town mentality here. And
it's so interesting when you look at like our recollections of the 80s in like our current trend of retro kind of nostalgia. So the current trend of nostalgia is very much highlighting the 80s. So you have your Stranger Things, your Glow,
American Horror Story, Killer, Slayer, whatever it's called. Oh, sorry, American Horror Story 1984 is what it's called.
Oh, yeah,
the current season, yeah.
So all those things are all like, you know, this like looking at the 80s as being this like neon glow kind of thing.
Synthwave.
Yeah, specifically Stranger Things was looking at it in terms of like D&D and has not in any way looked at the satanic panic element of it. It's quite interesting, but that we've kind of like ironed over that. But you kind of have to, because you can't look at the 80s in a positive way and not and engage with it without like, because it was a crappy place to be. It was very homophobic. It was very like economically shit. So
yeah, like everywhere in the 80s, like your working class people were completely being paved over. America was very homophobic with the AIDS crisis, but in the UK and Ireland there was like Section 28 and massive Catholic oppression of gay people. You know, there is a certain, like, I love the 80s aesthetic, but there is a certain like rose tinted element to that entirely. Yeah.
Okay, should we move into the dusting, Joel?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I have some Buffy bits for you. Can I read my Buffy bits?
I'm sorry, my brain stopped there for a second. Please give me your Buffy bits.
Okay, so Hansel is actually Andrew from Desperate Housewives.
What?
Yeah, you know the guy who basically, Andrew Van de Kamp, he's the young boy, the 16-year-old who basically is gay, and his mother finds out about it and is disgusted.
I do remember this, yes.
Yeah, it's great. Anyway, that's him. So Michael is Blake Sennett from Ryle O'Reilly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he's actually listed here as Blake Swenson, but he's gone by Blake Sennett otherwise. He is a child actor.
And one of those a stage name or something? Or
yeah, I think both might be stage names. Huh. But in Ryle O'Reilly, very important naughties group with Jenny Lewis, who we went to see a couple of weeks ago live.
She was amazing, actually.
She was incredible.
I should go listen to some of that after this.
You should. Ryle O'Reilly, definitely one of my favourite bands. Two of their albums would probably get onto my top 50 albums of all time. But yeah, that's him. And
you have made a list of your top 50 albums.
But only one of them appears on it, so I'm kind of like, maybe I should take one out and replace one of the brand new albums with it, because we don't listen to brand new anymore. But Jenny Lewis and Blake, they were actually going out at various points during their band. He sings a lot. He's the guitarist for the band as well. But it's just mad because he had actually already formed the band while having recorded this. Okay. And it's so weird to see like a member of Ryle O'Reilly actively be in this episode. Here, let me show you a picture of him. Huh. Yeah, there's Michael. Anyway, I just thought it was really funny. Apparently, the German shown on screen in this episode is just like wildly inaccurate. 33 words and 28 mistakes is one of the things I read about it.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
Ruh-roh indeed. So, and the other note I had here is that, I have two things. One is that Snyder at one point in this episode says, I love the smell of like scared Desperate Librarian in the morning, which is of course an Apocalypse Now reference, which he's also in a parody of in Restless, in Xander's Dream.
Yes.
He's a part of an Apocalypse Now parody.
Yeah, so he plays the Marlon Brando character.
Yeah. So
Xander has a dream where he goes and...
I always wonder if like that kind of thing is like the show regurgitating its own subconsciousness, like that kind of connection, which is always really good fun. And the IMDb page for this episode has one of the trivia notes is, the future director, Jerome Elston Scott, played the stoner boy who was led away from his locker in the opening scene. And I looked up this director. He hasn't directed anything of note. So I was like, oh, you mean future director who is me, who's writing this
future director, current me.
Exactly. Just being like, oh, trivia note, I'm here. And maybe I'll be important someday.
Also, the only character that we see, or I remember seeing during the locker raid scene that's taken away, is a black student. And the reason I mention it is that given the really like small number of people of color in this show, I find that when they do turn up, it's often like not great circumstances.
Yeah,
to be the one kid you're taking away other than the main characters.
Yeah, it's not a great look.
Yeah,
give me some Buffy bits there, Joel.
So this episode obviously discusses censorship and mothers against mothers opposing the occult,
Yeah.
burning books,
Or also known as Moto.
which is ironic, which is funny because the BBC, when this episode was aired, edited a scene at the end which I actually think was an amazing shot, where Buffy, who is tied to a stake, breaks the stake and rams it down the demon's throat to kill it, and then she's like, did I get it? And then it cooks away and it's like she's fully impaled his head with it. So it's just interesting that they censor an episode about censorship, essentially.
Yeah, it is ironic. Amy this is her final appearance until the end of season 4, where she gets turned back from a rat very briefly,
Momentarily, yeah,
and then comes back again in season 6.
Yeah, a lot of Hecate in this episode as well.
Hecate and Diane, both of whom were called upon in Bewitched, Bothered and Bewildered as well.
Yes, absolutely. Giles gets knocked out again.
Woohoo!
And Cordelia hangs on lampshade on her saying, how often are you knocked out? One of these days you're going to wake up in a coma.
I did a count. 10 so far, I think.
Yeah. Very prophetic for Cordelia, though, unfortunately. Cordelia's great in this episode as well.
She is great, and I think a couple of places have noted that this is the beginning of her coming back into the fold a little bit.
Yeah.
Which is nice.
Absolutely.
When Cordelia and Giles are trying to get into the town hall, and Giles takes Cordelia's hairpin to unlock a door, and she's like, "Oh yeah, you're a little street urchin when you're a child," and she says, "You must just look back on that and cringe."
Yeah, I'm always terrified watching the show. It's like, did they meant the word cringe in that sentence? I never know. It's just so. This language has so permeated both me and the universe. So,
yeah, it's so true.
That was very good. Just throughout the episode, Sheila referring to Buffy as Bunny Slayers.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to be friends with that Bunny Slayers anymore.
No, it's
Bunny Slayers, Bunny Summers. Sorry. No, now I am the mother. Have fun. Have fun editing that one down. It's just all right bars. Sorry about that.
Great. Okay. Fashion. So I didn't actually know too much. There was no fashion craziness in this episode.
Michael looks amazing.
Michael looks incredible. I want to dress up as Michael for Halloween next year.
I actually I did like it, because I tell you why. All the background actors in the high school tend to be fairly generic. You don't actually get a lot of visual clicks. So he just looks so Central Bank.
It does look very Central Bank.
I was very happy with it, I could say.
So we also the other major fashion note, I suppose, is that Sheila does note that Willow cut her hair 6 months late.
Yeah, Jesus.
And Sarah Michelle Gellar's fringe disaster continues to try to be hidden. They're trying to brush it into the side of her hair, and it looks awful. I mean, it's so sad to see Sarah Michelle Gellar look so like failed in her hair.
Get well soon, fringe.
Yeah, did you see that video this week of going around of Courtney Cox?
No.
Oh my god, we have to watch it. She did on Instagram. She was watching Scream 3, and if you remember, Scream 3 features Courtney Cox with the worst fringe broke of all time, where her fringe is maybe an inch long and goes from here to here, temple to temple.
Yeah.
And it looks fucking insane. And she's like, I don't know what you're talking about. It looks absolutely fine. Maybe I'll go back to that. And then takes scissors and starts cutting her own hair. And I have to presume it was a wig.
Yeah.
But it's just Courtney Cox in a moment of genuine self-awareness and funniness. I think Courtney Cox is my second favorite friend post Friends.
Who's the first? Oh, Lisa Kudrow. Sorry.
Lisa Kudrow. Yeah. I mean, The Comeback is the best thing. It's one of the best TV shows. Full stop. But it's also, I think, the best post-Friends thing that anyone did. Second one being Cougar Town, which was weirdly funny.
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing. If people don't know this, you should definitely search out The Comeback, and also Web Therapy, which is something else that she did.
Really good, both.
Yeah. Lisa Kudrow is an amazing actress. She's everyone likes her as Phoebe. She's funny as Phoebe. She's probably the best actor out of all of them. Matthew Perry has done some interesting stuff, some dramatic stuff. I wouldn't necessarily say he's a good actor.
Yeah, his guest appearances on things like Good Wife, West Wing, Scrubs, all quite good.
Everyone else has done a couple of things which are good, but Lisa Kudrow is actually just amazing.
Yeah, in The Comeback, she creates a post-Phoebe personality that's so distinct from Phoebe and so brilliant. I mean, what's Valerie Cherish?
Yeah.
Valerie Cherish is
one of the great television
characters.
Absolutely.
I mean, just so distinct, so fucking insane. And, I'll never hear the phrase, I got it.
Yeah.
Without like having to do that impression 20 times.
A Michael Scott-esque character where she's incredibly difficult and annoying, but if anyone else hurts you, you're like, don't touch my baby. Yeah.
I'm so glad we've done all this to avoid talking about fashion, because there's no fashion notes, except for Willow wears a ski jumper, which I quite like.
Yeah, when we say ski jumper, it's a ski jumper with a picture of someone skiing on it, which I think she's misunderstood the brief. But no, it was a very fashion flat episode, to be honest. Yeah. Otherwise, just in Buffy, I'll loop this into Buffy Bits just so we can talk about it going on in future. But very briefly, a very odd element of this is that they call a meeting in town hall and have the mayor speak about the murders. And the mayor, who is the big bad, who is aware of all the demonic things happening in town, he just kind of sees people saying we need to get the demons and the slayers, and says, I'm out here for the rest of the episode. I didn't really believe any of that. Like, he would have more agency in that, I think. Yeah,
I agree. Death count?
Yeah, so the actual death count of the episode is mercifully quite low. Mr. Sanderson, who was dusted by Buffy in the Mom and Buffy bonding scene in the opening of the episode. And then top and tail, the demon, the unnamed Hansel and Gretel demon, impaled by Timothy Dalton in Hot Fuzz by Buffy.
Good point, yeah.
At the end of the episode.
Great, okay. Do you have a rating? Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I will give this 7.2 stage rats out of 10.
Oh, beautiful. Give me your explanation.
I think it has, as an episode of Buffy, it has a lot of the flaws you identify with bad episodes in the past in terms of inconsistency of character voice, weird narrative choices and all that kind of stuff. But I thought I had a lot of fun watching it, which is kind of one of the first things I always look for. Joyce, great portrayal, great performance by Joyce throughout. It's a real Joyce-centric episode.
Agreed.
And I think that the thematic stuff about occultism and witches and the metaphor there sustained it for me in terms of we don't actually talk about this a lot. So I just enjoy watching it, but I couldn't recommend it. I would never, if you're talking about episodes, you would show someone if you want to get them to watch Buffy, this ain't it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm actually going to give it 6.0 neck ruptures out of 10.
Am I the nice one now? I think it might be the nice one.
Maybe. I think I tend to overrate things and underrate things.
Sure.
You tend to be a centrist, unsurprisingly. So
on the fence.
So... because you're bisexual. So this episode is like loads of fun. I mean, if I was drunk and watching this, I'd be cackling at lots of this stuff, but looking at it, it's a bit of a structural mess. It's a bit of a tonal mess. The themes it's exploring are heady and is inappropriately lightly dealt with. The reset at the end of the episode is such a mess, but I love it regardless. Thematically, it's actually an episode that appears in a lot of essays, which I actually find, I kind of have an opinion that if you take episodes like this and use it to build your thesis on motherhood in Buffy, it's kind of like not good faith arguments sometimes. This isn't the portrayal of Joyce as mother. Yeah, this is a portrayal of a theme explored through Joyce. Yeah. This isn't Buffy's voice in this episode all that much. There are parts where it's Buffy's voice, but it's more about trying to see your plot happen.
But who hasn't written an essay where they try to bend texts to fit their point?
Absolutely. It's so much fun to do so, and you should have fun with that kind of thing. But I think that this episode, it feels like the world resets after it. Yeah. And it feels like the show resets after it in the sense that it doesn't feel like the episode happened ever again. Yeah,
which is one of the strengths of Buffy, is generally not doing that and having the ongoing plot. So
exactly. Fun, but meh.
Okay, so that's us for this week for this episode of Buffy Boys. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please follow us on Twitter, tweet us, and tell us how much you enjoyed this episode and what your favourite part of it was. Sure, why not? So next week we're going to be watching and talking about Helpless, which is, I finally remember the name of it, which is Buffy's 18th birthday, and she suffers the cruciumentium, and we'll go from mother issues to daddy issues.
Did you notice, Joel, they actually highlighted it's going to be Buffy's episode next week in this episode, which I thought was actually structurally kind of nice. It made it feel like real world that was happening. Yeah, they're next week it's going to be Buffy's birthday, and it's noted.
Yeah, there's an actual sense of time in this, from Halloween to Christmas to all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of
nice. So thanks so much for listening. Brian, thanks so much for being here.
You're welcome.
And tell your friends, tell your soft goth boy witches, and we will see you next time on
Buffy Boys. That's the show. We're gonna go now, but I don't know how to stop using this voice.
See ya.
Bye.